get that picture again of Judas and Simon. Judas had it all together in terms of financial stability. And most of the story that we know about him was that he could handle the money, and so he was perceived as a leader. How many people do you know in the church that they gained their leadership because they have been financially successful in the world? And yet there is no spiritual depth to them at all. Simon Peter mumbled and bumbled himself through life. So welcome to each of you. All of us can find a place at that table, can't we? The mumbling and bumbling part. Eugene Peters was one of the first that prompted me to understand that comparison with Judas and Simon Peter. I'd really have kind of reduced Judas to a kind of a hole in the wall of my memory and never really brought him back. But when you bring him back and you see that in the context of who they were with Jesus, it was when Jesus began to say, if you take the oath of the office of following me, then there is within that oath an office. And he was beginning to explain that office to Peter. If you know much about the book of Mark, you know that chapter 8 means the shadow of the cross is ever so strong right then. You get through the first, 8 chapters, that's the half point of this 16th chapter book. You get there and you know something's going to happen. Again, Mark's the first gospel written, and it's the simplest and it's the clearest in terms of its approach. So there it is that we find Jesus wanting to make a distinction. And what Jesus is saying here is he wants you to understand that to accept the oath of being a follower of Christ means that you choose to be distinctive, that you choose to be different. And in order for you to know that, to understand that, you have to understand the distinctiveness of God. I thought about oaths this week and remembered back to January the 20th, 2009. You remember it if you were watching or if you saw a tape of it later. Chief Justice Roberts is executing to the president who had been elected, and he says the word faithfully in the wrong place. Remember it? If you don't, lots of people made a big deal about it because he said, I will execute the office of the president faithfully, and the president was trying to know that because he knew it wasn't stated exactly right, but ultimately it was, I will faithfully execute. And so he had just placed the faithfully in a different place. And as I looked back at that, I thought that's a distinction that doesn't make a difference. Let me tell you why it doesn't make a difference. I mean, lots of people jumped on that and said, well, he's really not, the president until he does that. And he's da-da-da-da. But go back to the 20th Amendment, if you would. 20th Amendment Constitution states the terms of the outgoing president and vice president shall end at the noon on the 20th day of January, and the mention of an oath of office is not found anywhere in the 20th Amendment. So as one friend said that I read, he said, actually, George W. Bush and Barack Obama could have done a fist bump along the pathway, and that would have been basically all that they needed to do. That is a distinction that makes no difference. So let's get to the passage that will confront you today. It is a strong passage. Mark 8:27. And Jesus went out along with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. In the way, he questioned his disciples, saying to them, who do people say that I am? And they told him, saying, John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and some others one of the prophets. And he continued by questioning them, but who do you say that I am? And Peter answered and said to them, you are the Christ. He warned them to tell no one about that. Now that's a point we'll make a little bit later, but you will see several times in the book of Mark where what we call the messianic secret, and that is where the Messiah has a certain secrecy to when he wants that told. Verse 31, and he began to teach them that the Son of Man, that's a less political term than the word Messiah would have been. Began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed and after 3 days rise again. And he was saying the matter plainly. And Peter took him aside, began to rebuke him. But turning around and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and he said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on God's interests but man's." He summoned the crowd with his disciples and he said to them, I'm just going to tell you, if you want to get challenged, just memorize these next few verses. If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses it, his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. What does it profit a person to gain the whole world and to forfeit his soul? For what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man, there's that phrase again, will also be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father and the holy angels. What we have here are two offices. Two offices. The first one, and if you want to follow along in your outline, the first one, the distinctiveness of Jesus, the Messiah, is the presence of a cross. Jesus is on the road with the disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asks his followers, "Who do people say that I am?" And they give him different things, and I can imagine in a modern world he would have said, "What are people tweeting about me out there in the real world? What are they saying?" The disciples answered, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others the prophet. But who do you say that I am?" And I will tell you that of the questions that need to be asked to this generation is ultimately that, because it comes down to this: who do you think Jesus is? When people come to me with all the different views and segments of what they might believe, I always come back to, what do you believe about Jesus? Because ultimately that is the determining line. That is the point about which you and I must discover and live out the experience of the oath that leads to an office. Jesus is taking an oath. He's saying to them, I'm taking an oath. I'm stepping up because now my oath is going to move me into an office, and that office is the office of being a Messiah. Not the kind of Messiah that you have heard about, because the kind of Messiah that you've heard about is a kind of commander-in-chief, the boss of the political thing. And that's why I think Jesus used the word Son of Man. It was a softer version from Daniel. The phrase was from Daniel. It was a softer version of saying to them, I am here on behalf of God, but it may not be what you think it's going to be. And he says, I'm going to undergo great suffering. Now, surely you know what is going on here. They look at him, and of the two paths that he could take, the Messiah, kingship, I'm going to tell you the way it is, and this is the way it's going to be done, and I've got all power and political, and, you obey me, and we're on the right path. That was one path. The other path was one of incredible suffering and pain, and one that would introduce the cross. And folks back then, you introduce the cross today, and folks think about a necklace or something. But you introduced the cross back then, they knew what the cross meant. The cross meant absolute devastation. It was the most horrific way to die. And so the thought of a God-man that was doing what he was doing to come to a cross was absolutely beyond their mind. So Peter is going to be the one who gets things straight. And so Peter gets the oath right, but he does not understand the office. And most of us do the same. Most of us do well about pledging allegiance to God, but we don't necessarily grasp the idea that this is not something that simply we do. It is something of who we are. When was the last time you made a declaration of allegiance and it did not result in the intended action? Let me give you some examples. I will marry you. I will be faithful to you. I will provide for you. I could keep going through the list. Or how about I will join the church and I will tithe and I will support the leaders of our church? How are you doing with those declarations of allegiance? Ask Judas and Peter, an oath is empty unless the office is occupied. An oath is empty until the office is occupied. They didn't like the fact that Jesus was going to be a Messiah, but the distinctiveness of a follower also, secondly, is the presence of sacrifice. When Jesus talks openly about the suffering and death, Peter takes him on and begins to rebuke him. And it is absolutely inconceivable to Peter that God's anointed leader, very strong word, would have to suffer a humiliating death. But here comes Jesus, quickly turning the tables and saying, "Get behind me, for you are setting your mind not upon spiritual things, but upon human things." So what does all this mean? Does it mean that we need to spend more time in private prayer? Does it mean that we need to perform a moral inventory in our lives? Do we need to cleanse ourselves of all evil? Well, it might mean some of that, but it's certainly much more than that. Jesus calls together this crowd of his disciples, and he says to them, you want to become my followers, then deny yourself, take up the cross, and follow me. Now, I have spent the good part of the week today, this week, looking at the issue of following Jesus. And there is a book out there, as you might expect, that really takes that to task a bit, and then there's those that disagree with that. So we're going to talk about that for the next few minutes. It's a very interesting thing, particularly in light of the fact that we're looking at some changes, looking at some options, looking at some things in terms of transitioning and worshiping in a different option and style. Michael Frost and Alan Hurst have written a book called Re-Jesus. R-E-G-E-S-U-S. What they say there is this: a good church upbringing will do many marvelous things for you. But one of the unfortunate things a good church upbringing will do is that it will convince you that Jesus is to be worshiped but not followed. Now let that settle in on you for a minute. What do they mean by that? Think about it. Their point is that the church does a better job teaching us to worship Jesus rather than it teaches us to follow Jesus. In other words, the church is better at telling us about how we take an oath, but not necessarily how we occupy the office. When you read the Gospel of Mark, you discover that Jesus is less concerned with people pledging allegiance than he is about people following him. In fact, I took this theme and found some other things that connected to it. Imagine this. Richard Rohr, in an address to Yale University to medical students. Now, I would have thought he would have talked about Jesus, maybe 30 years ago to address Yale medical students, but it was only about 10 years ago, 2005. He said this: "You know, Jesus never once said, 'Worship me.' He said, 'Follow me.' And he said one of the cleverest ways to avoid following someone is to worship them." Now think about that. It really works, he says. It's very clever. You just put him on a pedestal, you make God out of him, and you pay all kinds of homage to this God figure, and then you don't have to do what he does. Isn't that true? If you're not careful, that's what we can do. "Oh, what did you do today?" "I worshiped God at church." You not only have conditioned that you did something at a certain time in a certain place, but then you did it. And it's done, and therefore you've done that thing, and you've made it yet another list of things to check off. But one of those Californians, senior minister at First United Methodist out in California, Lodi, California, he got into this discussion and he disagreed, and I was still kind of processing my thoughts. He says, if the church truly worshiped, I don't think following would be a problem, he says. The problem is that we seem to have defined Messiah narrowly as simply personal Savior. Now, let me just tell you, we Baptists we've owned that term for a long time. You need to accept Jesus as your personal Savior. And believe me, I stone cold theologically believe that. So that's not a problem with it. But there is a problem if it stops there. He said, in other words, it's all about what Jesus can do for me. Now he's preaching. He says, we have also defined follower as religious consumer, not as disciple of Christ. The sadness is that when we approach worship with these understandings, then worship usually misses the mark, even though we may not realize it. Now let me tell you why that got all over my brain this week. Okay, by offering two options for service, are we making it better for our consumers? Well, I think so. But what was the reason we started this path? I am of the belief that you cannot worship without serving, and you cannot serve without worship. You know, that those are two hands on the same body. The problem is we get into a pattern of worship that either does this and simply comes to an event and does not choose to participate, and gets cold by that nature, and worship becomes, again, just an event. I worship today, so I put Jesus on the shelf for the week. Or we come to a worship experience where we can open our hearts and minds and enter in. Now, when it says for those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. Back to our friends who say we don't need to worship God, Christ as much as follow him, and how that plays together. They say one thing, and then we'll kind of land on this. How can we call ourselves Christian unless what we're doing is building squarely on the rock of Christ? That's Frost and Hurst in the book Read Jesus. How can we call ourselves Christian unless we take our job descriptions from him? And this is where they say something that I find interesting. He said, we need to pickle ourselves into the gospel. I've never heard that verb before used in that way, but we need to pickle, in other words, we need to put ourselves in the middle of the gospel, because they must become our primary stories and our reference point for following Jesus. There is no truer way to encounter Jesus afresh than prayerfully cycling through the gospels and asking God to give us fresh insight into the remarkable person we have found. Now, let's talk a little bit about the Hebrew word for worship. Hebrew word for worship means work and worship. Paul transliterates that, moves it over into Romans 12:1, where he talks about we are transformed by our minds and the sacrifice and all the imagery there. We talked a lot about that in our worship series. But let me try to land with this and where we are and what it's doing for us. There is the tension that the world feels right now between consumer church, I come for me, I come to get my cup filled up, and then I can go back into the real world and live without telling anybody about Jesus, because I got him and I put him on a shelf for this week. And that's when I ran across an article that I read this guy regularly. His name is Tom Schultz. Matter of fact, there's a movie coming out that you'll hear more about that he was a part of putting together. And I think the movie's title is Why God Has Left the Building. But in an article he said it caught my attention because about 20 years ago is when I first heard somebody came to me, or I heard from one of my pastor friends, the favorite thing to say, particularly, and it happened to me when I was in Nashville, when you have a church on every corner, and I mean literally in Nashville you do, it is per capita that has the most density of churches, I think, than any city in America. The phrase that we often heard there, and I hear it some here, but not nearly as much, is, I'm not getting fed at my church. He took the phrase, Tom Schultz, and this is what he said. That Bill, I don't know who Bill is, but Bill came to him and said he's thinking about changing churches because he's not getting fed. So what does Bill mean? It means that Bill and many others who express similar feelings go to weekend services expecting to receive encouragement and solace and inspiration, and none of those are bad things, but they're simply not the only thing. So there is this movie that he's put out, and I haven't seen it yet, but I'm thinking about bringing it to our church and let us have a night with it, because you can kind of rent it. An elder in the documentary in that movie, When God Left the Building, states this. He said, I believe it's to keep, he's talking about the church, I believe it's to keep the membership up, to keep it fortified, to keep everyone feeling good about being there, and to keep people desiring to come there and want to be there. Is that really it? You need to go to church so you be fed. Whereas there is a piece of truth to that, it is not the whole truth. If the church is just there to meet my wants, and consumer usually speaks to wants more than just needs, then the church will become something that we don't intend for, or God did not intend for it to be. Sociologist Joshua Packard reports in his book, Church Refugees, that these people that he's talking about here we're calling these folks overstuffed. He says they're tired of the same high-fat meal that's dished to them weekly, and they want to actively exercise their faith. So let me see if I can grab all these points and put them together. He's talking about the dones. You know, there's a whole group of people right now who are done with the local church, and they've shifted gears because, you know, I think they got tired of the sugary sweet, just we're going to feed you, hand feed you, give you whatever you want so that you will hopefully stay in the course. But I want us to have a healthier diet. The image I've had for a long time, and he simply uses the same image that I've thought of. He says we need to stop looking to, he's talking to those of us who are members and attenders of church, and stop looking for a trough for you to be fed. And look for a Jesus-centered community where you can be the church, where you're given full access to love one another, to experience God, and to exercise faith. Now let me tell you why I think the structure will allow more of that. If, and again, we're going to give it a 6-week shot, and if it goes well, then we'll invest another 6 weeks, and if it goes well, then guess what? We're in summer, and if it can make it through summer, then God help us all. It might work, you know. But if you can come to worship, and a friend of mine, one of you all said, you know, Dan, what's measurable? Well, what's measurable will be people doing two things: participating in worship. How can you measure that? I can tell if you're moving your mouth. That's how I can tell. You need to participate in worship, and why else come but participate in singing? And then you can participate by looking at Dan as he preaches and say, man, he's really right. He's amen. Well, you don't have to do it like quite that bad, but yes, of saying, you know, of us saying together, yes, that's where we're going, that's where we're heading. And that you will have a style of worship that will allow you to express fully your faith. And let me just say, I think feeling our faith is incredibly important. But if at the end of the day, my faith is all about feeling, that I'm not going to feel like telling other people about Jesus very much. I really won't. Unless I have the gift of evangelism, I won't do that. But if I'm able to believe what our mission statement says, love God, serve others, and tell your story, then what's going to happen? I am going to come to church, be in a setting where I will sing my heart out, listen to the word preached, and then I will go do the rest of what I want to do, and that is serve others and tell my story. One of the best things that's happened in our strategic planning process so far is going over to Brighton Center. You know, we're connecting with Brighton Center in a very, let me use a really neat word, spiritual synergy or something. There's something going on. We are connecting. We're volunteering there. We're doing some things with them that are that's going to help people at the front line of the food line, at the front line of the get a job line, at the front line. These folks are on the front line of helping people in ways that the church is only dreaming about doing. I recently sent a couple of our folks to a conference that the state convention was putting on about reaching people, reaching the poor, investing in loving people, and how that would play out. They brought 2 experts in that preached about it, but nobody knew how to do it, in all honesty. Our 2 guys should have taught the thing, because it would have shown them that this is how a church connects with a social agency and does this stuff the right way. We are on the precipice of doing something incredible here. I really do believe that. I don't know how much the worship thing is going to work, but we're going to give it a shot. I do know that the serving piece of this and that the children's piece of this, I think both of those are absolute no-doubters, and that they're going to have to be the foundation under which we build everything else. There's a church in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Now, I believe, when I read that there was a church in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, I've never been there, so that may paint my view of it, but that they were doing some exciting things. I said, I didn't think anything happened in South Dakota that was exciting at all. There's a church in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Their mission is this. The point is to serve. That's their mission. The point is to serve. In other words, it doesn't really matter that we worship Jesus unless we're willing to follow Jesus, and to follow Jesus means that we must be willing to serve. The people understand the point is to be fed. One of the events they took on recently is that they delivered 32,000 pounds of ham and bacon to the needy. Now, there's a part of me that says, is that really helping their health by giving them that much? but for those who really don't eat, that's a pretty powerful thing. The pastor of the church says it this way. He said, we believe service is the key and often neglected path of spiritual formations. They call their small groups, their Sunday school, their Bible study classes, they call them life serve groups. Because they not only study the Word together, they not only pray together, but they, in fact, serve together. So, he says, we are challenged to consider how to measure success differently, and it's about transformation, not about nickels and noses. He's right. So, I've told you today about my tension about the consumer issue. I've told you how I've resolved at least that for us in terms of doing the new structure, not knowing if it will help, but I know this, we've got to do something a little different in order to be a little more invested. And I believe it will work, but we will see. Every week when we plan worship with 2 things in mind. To meet the need of the worshiper in terms of allowing them to have a corporate experience where they can do 2 things. Learn a new insight, think about God in a way that challenges them. And secondly, that we would sing and do something emotional by a video. I don't know about you, but I couldn't watch that video and not be emotionally connected. That we would do something in the service that would emotionally connect you. But ultimately, for one thing, and that is when you leave here to tell God's story in your life. Not everybody has the gift of evangelism, but everybody has the gift of a God-given story that changed their lives. And that's what we must tell. And we do that sometimes by serving and loving other people and not even saying, oh, by the way, you need to come to Jesus right now. There's a gentleman out here this morning that shows up. He's a homeless guy, or at least he lives in a hotel, or something. Shows up and he does the sidewalks. I don't know if you saw him coming in. We already pay to get our sidewalks done, by the way. But he does the ones that they don't do. And of course, he comes to me and wants me to pay him. Sometimes I tell him I can, sometimes I tell him I can't. But mainly, I just kind of hang out with him. He wants to know what to call me. And I say, call me something nice. And he calls me Pastor Dan. He's never been in this church worship, but he calls me Pastor Dan. I will know that we as a church are making a difference when those kind of people are hanging out. The other day I pulled onto Scott Street, and there was a line of people coming out of this building. I said, what on earth are they giving away? You know, I want to get in line for it or whatever, you know. They're homeless. They were waiting for a place to lay down their head and sleep. And you know, they're right now looking for another place. I don't know how we're supposed to be involved there. But I think as we worship better, as we come together, if it's finding the style you want to that will allow you to sing more and invest more and get excited more, then I want that for you. If it's not, then let's just come and do whatever we want to do and leave here, but do what God has asked us to do, and that is this: we need to serve others. And I want you to become a people who are willing to tell your story. It doesn't matter that it's our mission statement unless it becomes your mission statement. When I was at Brighton Center the other day, and several of our members were sitting around the table, and several of them had already gotten involved in doing their training, and I'm going Tuesday afternoon to do my training. Maybe that's what you're supposed to be doing. I don't know. But we've got to find a way to love God, serve others, and tell our story. Let's pray together.